Mafia boss's son kept crying in the restaurant until the waitress said, "He just needs a mom." What if you saw a powerful man, someone who commanded respect wherever he went, completely helpless as his 3-year-old son wailed in the corner booth of a quiet family restaurant? Vincent Castellano, a 42-year-old man whose name carried weight in certain circles, sat with his shoulders sagging as little Anthony's cries echoed through the nearly empty diner. The other patrons glanced over with a mixture of sympathy and irritation, but Vincent seemed frozen, his large hands hovering uselessly near his son's trembling form. The child had been crying for 20 minutes straight, and nothing Vincent tried seemed to work. Then from across the room, a gentle voice cut through the chaos like a warm embrace. "Excuse me," said the waitress, approaching their table with the kind of smile that instantly put people at ease. "I think I know what he needs." Her words would change everything for this unlikely pair. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Vincent Castellano wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. In his world, showing weakness could be dangerous, and admitting you couldn't handle something as simple as comforting your own child felt like the deepest kind of failure. He'd built his reputation on being in control, on having answers, on never letting anyone see him struggle. But here he was, in Lucy's diner on a quiet Tuesday evening, completely at a loss as his son Anthony continued to sob. The little boy had seemed fine when they'd arrived 30 minutes earlier. Vincent had planned this as a simple dinner out, just the two of them, like he tried to do every Tuesday when his business allowed. Anthony usually loved these outings, chattering about his day at preschool and carefully choosing what he wanted to eat from the colorful children's menu. But tonight something had shifted. The moment they'd sat down, Anthony had grown quiet, then clingy, and finally inconsolable. "Hey, buddy, what's wrong?" Vincent had whispered, his voice soft in a way that would have surprised his associates. With Anthony, he became someone different, someone gentler. He'd tried everything he could think of, offering ice cream before dinner, pulling out his phone to show cartoons, even attempting to make silly faces that usually sent his son into giggles. Nothing worked. The other diners were starting to stare, and Vincent felt heat rising in his cheeks. An elderly couple near the window kept glancing over with concerned expressions, and a family with teenagers looked increasingly annoyed. Vincent considered leaving, but something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of his own father, who'd never had patience for tears or weakness. Vincent had promised himself he'd be different with Anthony. The waitress who'd spoken was named Diane, according to her name tag. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd been working at Lucy's for 8 years. Vincent had heard her tell another customer, and there was something about her presence that felt immediately trustworthy. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the bench beside Anthony. Vincent nodded, though uncertainty flickered across his face. In his experience, strangers rarely had good intentions, but something about this woman seemed different. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way you might approach a frightened animal. "Hi there, sweetheart," Diane said softly, settling beside Anthony without trying to touch him. "I'm Diane. I work here, and I noticed you seem really sad." The little boy's cries quieted slightly, though tears still streamed down his flushed cheeks. "You know what? I have a little boy, too. Well, he's not so little anymore. He's 22 now, but I remember when he used to get upset like this." Vincent watched, fascinated despite himself, as Anthony gradually turned toward this stranger who spoke to him like he mattered, like his feelings were important. It was something Vincent struggled with, this ability to simply sit with someone's pain without trying to fix it immediately. "Sometimes," Diane continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "when children cry like this, it's because they're missing something very important, something that makes them feel safe and loved." She glanced up at Vincent, and in that moment, he saw understanding in her eyes that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "He just needs a mom," Diane said gently, the words hanging in the air between them like a truth too painful to acknowledge. Vincent felt his breath catch in his throat. How could this stranger see what he'd been trying so hard to ignore? Anthony's crying had stopped completely now, and the little boy was looking up at Diane with the kind of trust that children reserve for people who truly understand them. Vincent's wife, Isabella, had died in a car accident 18 months ago, when Anthony was barely 2. The grief had nearly destroyed Vincent, but he'd forced himself to keep going for his son's sake. He'd hired the best nannies money could buy, enrolled Anthony in the finest preschool, and made sure every material need was met. But lately, he'd noticed things that worried him. Anthony would stare longingly at mothers dropping off their children at school. He'd grown quiet during bedtime stories that featured mommies. And recently, he'd started asking questions that broke Vincent's heart. "Daddy, why don't I have a mommy like Jacob does? Or when is mommy coming home?" Vincent had always deflected these questions, changing the subject or distracting Anthony with toys or activities. He'd told himself that love and time would be enough, that eventually the hole in their lives would somehow fill itself. But sitting here now, watching his son respond to this woman's maternal instincts, Vincent realized how naive he'd been. "I lost my wife," Vincent said quietly, the admission feeling like it was being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. It was the first time he'd said those words to a stranger, the first time he'd acknowledged the reality outside of his inner circle. In his world, personal information was dangerous, but something about Diane made him feel safe. "I'm so sorry," Diane replied, and Vincent could hear the sincerity in her voice. She wasn't offering empty platitudes or trying to fix anything. She was simply acknowledging his pain. "How long has it been?" "1.5 years, Vincent answered, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "I thought I was doing okay, that we were managing fine. But lately—" He gestured helplessly toward Anthony, who was now leaning slightly against Diane's arm. "Children need different things at different stages," Diane said softly. "When they're very young, they need food and safety and basic care. But as they get older, they start noticing what's missing. It doesn't mean you're failing him. It means he's growing up and recognizing that he has needs you can't fulfill alone." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd been so focused on providing for Anthony, on protecting him from the harsh realities of Vincent's business, that he'd missed this fundamental need his son was developing. Anthony had stopped crying entirely now and was playing with the small toy truck he'd brought to dinner, making soft engine noises as he drove it along the table's edge. But he stayed close to Diane, occasionally glancing up at her as if to make sure she wasn't going anywhere. "What am I supposed to do?" Vincent asked the question, slipping out before he could stop it. For a man who was used to having answers, admitting confusion felt foreign and frightening. "If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." Diane smiled gently, an expression full of understanding and something that might have been hope. "Well," she said, "maybe we start by talking about what Anthony really needs, and then we figure out how to give it to him." The conversation that followed changed everything Vincent thought he knew about being a father. Diane didn't judge him or make him feel inadequate. Instead, she helped him see that recognizing Anthony's needs wasn't a failure on his part. It was actually the mark of a loving parent who was paying attention. "I can't just replace his mother," Vincent said, the words coming out more harshly than he'd intended. The guilt he'd been carrying for months was finally surfacing. Isabella she was everything good about our family. She made our house feel like a home. She knew exactly what to say when Anthony was scared, how to make him laugh when he was sad. "I'm just trying to keep him safe and fed and make sure he doesn't grow up to be—" He stopped himself, remembering where they were. "Like you?" Diane asked gently, and Vincent was startled by her directness. Most people in his life were too afraid to speak to him so plainly. "My business isn't something I'm proud of," Vincent admitted, lowering his voice even further. "But it's what I know, what I'm good at. I always told myself I was building something for Anthony's future." But now I wonder if I'm just creating more problems for him. Diane watched Anthony, who had crawled into her lap and was now contentedly playing with his truck against her uniform apron. "You know what I see when I look at you two?" she said. "I see a father who brings his son out for dinner every Tuesday night, who speaks to him gently, who worries about his happiness. I see a little boy who feels safe with his daddy, who knows he's loved even when he's sad." Vincent felt tears threatening, an emotion he'd trained himself to suppress years ago. "But it's not enough, is it? Look at him with you. In 10 minutes you've given him something I can't." "I haven't given him anything you don't have," Diane replied firmly. "I've just reminded him what it feels like to have a mother figure nearby. But Vincent, you can't be his mother. You shouldn't try to be. What you can do is make sure he has access to that kind of nurturing." The suggestion that followed was both simple and terrifying. Diane explained that she'd been thinking about leaving the restaurant business for a while, that she missed being home with children after years of raising her own son. She'd been considering nanny work, she said, but hadn't found the right family. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," she said quickly, seeing the caution in Vincent's eyes. "I'm talking about being Anthony's caregiver, someone who can provide the maternal influence he's craving while respecting your role as his father." The idea scared Vincent more than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Letting someone into their lives, trusting a stranger with his most precious possession, went against every instinct he'd developed over the years. But watching Anthony trace letters on Diane's palm with his tiny finger, seeing the peace that had settled over his son's face, Vincent realized that his instincts might be wrong about this. "Why would you want to do that?" he asked. "You don't know anything about me, about what my life is really like. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." Diane smiled, and for the first time that evening it reached her eyes completely. "Because sometimes," she said, "when life takes something away from you, it gives you the chance to give that same thing to someone else who needs it." 3 weeks later, Vincent found himself doing something he'd never imagined, sitting in his living room, watching Diane read bedtime stories to Anthony, feeling like his house was becoming a home again. The transition hadn't been easy. Vincent's security team had been suspicious, running background checks and asking pointed questions about Diane's motivations. His business associates wondered why he suddenly seemed calmer, more focused, less volatile in their dealings. But Anthony was transforming before Vincent's eyes. The little boy, who'd been growing increasingly withdrawn and clingy, was now chattering excitedly about his days, running to greet Diane each morning with hugs and stories about his dreams. He'd started calling her Miss Diane at first, then simply Diane, and recently Vincent had heard him whisper almost Mommy when he thought no one was listening. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Anthony fell off his bicycle in the driveway and scraped his knee badly. Vincent had been on an important call in his study when he heard the crying start. By the time he'd hung up and rushed outside, Diane was already there, cleaning the wound gently while Anthony sobbed against her shoulder. "It hurts so bad," Anthony cried. And Vincent's instinct was to tell his son to be brave, to stop crying, to tough it out the way Vincent had been taught as a child. But Diane did something different. "I know it hurts, sweetheart," she said, holding him close. "Sometimes when we get hurt, we need to cry about it. That's okay. Crying doesn't make you weak. It just means you're human." She kissed the top of his head, and Vincent watched his son's shoulders relax in a way that reminded him painfully of Isabella. But then something unexpected happened. As Diane was applying a colorful bandage to Anthony's knee, the little boy looked up at Vincent with eyes full of trust rather than the careful watchfulness Vincent had grown accustomed to. "Daddy," Anthony said, reaching out his small hand, "I'm scared the hurt will come back." Vincent moved closer, unsure of what to say. In the past, he might have promised to make sure Anthony never got hurt again, a promise he knew he couldn't keep. Instead, he found himself following Diane's example, Sometimes we do get hurt, Vincent said slowly, sitting down on the concrete beside them. But you know what I've learned? When we have people who love us nearby, the hurt doesn't last as long, and we don't have to face it alone. Anthony considered this seriously, then nodded. Like how Miss Diane is here now, and you're here too? Exactly like that, Vincent replied, feeling something shift inside his chest. For the first time since Isabella's death, he felt like he might actually know how to be the father Anthony needed. That evening, after Anthony had fallen asleep between them during movie night, Diane and Vincent talked about the future. The conversation was careful, respectful, but honest. They discussed boundaries and expectations, Anthony's needs and Vincent's concerns about his business affecting their arrangement. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. I want you to know, Vincent said finally, that having you here, watching what you do for Anthony, it's made me realize I can be a better father than I thought possible. Diane smiled, and in that moment, Vincent understood that sometimes the most important business deals aren't about money or power. They're about love, trust, and the courage to let people help you become who you're meant to be. 6 months later, Vincent Castellano was a different man, though the change was so gradual that even he barely noticed it at first. The shift began in small moments. The way he found himself smiling when he heard Anthony's laughter echoing through the house, how he started coming home earlier to help with bedtime routines, the peace he felt watching Diane teach his son to bake cookies on Sunday afternoons. Anthony had blossomed in ways that amazed everyone who knew him. The quiet, sometimes withdrawn little boy had become confident and expressive, secure in the knowledge that he was loved by 2 adults who genuinely cared about his well-being. He'd stopped asking painful questions about his mother and instead began talking about his daily adventures with the enthusiasm of a child who felt safe in his world. The relationship between Vincent and Diane had evolved naturally, built on mutual respect and their shared love for Anthony. There was no romance, no complication, just 2 adults who had found a way to create something beautiful from their combined losses and strengths. Diane had lost her own husband 5 years earlier and understood the weight of single parenthood. Vincent had learned to trust someone outside his blood family for the first time in decades. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the back porch watching Anthony chase fireflies in the garden, Vincent realized he needed to tell Diane something he'd been thinking about for weeks. "I've been making some changes," he said quietly. "In my business, I mean, moving toward more legitimate operations, stepping back from some of the darker aspects of what I've been involved in." He paused, watching his son's delight as he captured a lightning bug in his cupped hands. "I want Anthony to be proud of his father someday. I want to be the kind of man Isabella would have wanted him to become." Diane nodded, unsurprised. She'd watched Vincent's transformation over the months, and seen how becoming a true father to Anthony had awakened something better in him. "How does that feel?" she asked. "Terrifying," Vincent admitted with a laugh, "but right. For the first time in years, it feels right." Anthony came running over then, glowing with excitement about the firefly he'd caught and released. As he climbed into Vincent's lap to tell them about his discovery, Diane felt a deep satisfaction wash over her. This wasn't the family she'd imagined when she was younger, but it was the one she'd been meant to find. Later that night, after Anthony had fallen asleep and Diane had gone to her own apartment in the guest house Vincent had built for her, Vincent stood in his son's doorway and marveled at the peace on the little boy's face. Anthony slept soundly now, without the restless movements and occasional nightmares that had troubled him before Diane came into their lives. Vincent thought about that night in the restaurant, about the desperate father he'd been and the confused, heartbroken child Anthony had been. Sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary Tuesday evenings, as chance encounters with strangers who turned out to be exactly what you needed. He'd learned that asking for help wasn't a weakness, that love, sometimes, meant admitting what you couldn't do alone, and that families could be built in the most unexpected ways. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and the beautiful ways people can heal each other.